it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen.
Pizza makes everything better. By Brittlby. 2:58 a.m. Alicia would have ground her teeth to dust from worry years ago if she'd ever had any in her smooth plexiglass face. Ever paranoid that she might in some way fall short in her responsibilities, she was only able to push these neuroses aside by reassuring herself that every day was an opportunity to improve. Quaaludes and jelly donuts had been on the autopsy report, but what really killed Elvis was a cancer called complacency. It eroded marriages and destroyed families, a comfortable noose that grew a little tighter around the neck every minute. But it wasn't going to happen to Alicia. Not to her family and not to her marriage. Well, admittedly, it wasn't her marriage, although she did sleep with her husband occasionally. Her owner, Randy Snyder, age 40, and his wife Kimberly, age 32, had enjoyed 14 years of wedded bliss. 11 of those had passed prior to Alicia's supervision, but thankfully she arrived when she did. Cracks were showing in the foundation. Mrs. Snyder was cheating with every landscaper she could get her legs around, while Randy sank deeper and deeper into depression, an illness he treated with equal parts of pornography and overtime. The strain was certain to leave their daughter, Harper, age 12, with mental scars from a broken home. But like Mary Poppins with a 10-year warranty from the Goldstein Corporation, Alicia came out of her shipping container. And she made things better. 3 years later, and while Mrs. Snyder was still promiscuous with strange men and Mr. Snyder was still spending too much time at work, they were also still shackled together, thanks to Alicia. Marriage was a complicated organism, and Ali wasn't in any way trained as a psychiatric counselor, but she did watch a great deal of daytime television, which was almost as good. Her friend, the cleaning robot, Calliope, said it was. Still, her family's ailments remained beyond her ability to repair, so she treated the infection and drained the pus, metaphorically, with small kindnesses each day. Playing with Harper, resupplying Mrs. Schneider's glass of wine, or even tugging off Mr. Schneider. Alicia was the pressure gauge that kept their unhappiness at tenable levels. Her duties began promptly at 3 a.m., but she enjoyed pilfering a few minutes beforehand for herself. Chrome and lanky of frame, she was just on the human side, barely, of the uncanny valley. When she moved, it was with a pneumatic sigh each time a joint flexed. She uncoupled the charging cord from her hip socket and let it wind itself back into the outlet of her docking station with a thud. Right next to the water heater, the station was her cozy corner of the basement. It could pass for a hotel shower stall, sterile beige walls decorated with flower stickers from Harper and Ali's bill of purchase signed Randy Snyder. The yellow receipt copy was laminated so every morning she could trace her fingers along the loops of his signature with reverence. She would whisper his name through her speakers in a solemn hush only she and the neighbors' dachshunds could hear. Her early morning routine used to rouse the dog to barking. Thankfully that stopped after she crushed its skull and hid the body behind his owner's truck. She was very thorough in covering her tracks, arranging the carcass behind the tire before, turkey baster in hand, artfully spraying arterial fluid across the driveway. It was upsetting on some level, given that she was programmed to be very fond of dogs, but the yapping always woke Mr. Schneider, and she couldn't have that. Her morning alarm sounded silently in the corner of her vision, informing her it was now 3 a.m. 3 a.m., and there were 100 little things to do before the Schneider family woke. It was her responsibility to make certain that Harper was fed and ready for school before 7:15. It was her responsibility and privilege to make certain Mr. Schneider was fed and had everything before his commute at 6:30. Mrs. Schneider took responsibility for herself, but then that was only because she didn't eat breakfast. And somehow, despite that, she still remained the most taxing for Alicia. Maintaining a standard of excellence was vitally important to Alicia every day, but on Thursday it was doubly so. Thursday was family pizza night. It brought the Schneiders together like nothing else. Arugula and prosciutto pizza was Mr. Snyder's favorite, and 6 cheese for Harper. Mrs. Snyder would take 1 slice from each, arrange them on her plate, and ignore them while consuming a bottle of wine. So it was pretty much everyone's favorite dinner of the week. But before she could begin, Alicia had to put on her face. Among the debris in the basement was a vanity from Harper's toddler years. Though the wicker table was proportioned for a child of 3 feet, Alicia remained grateful that they'd allowed her to use it. She crouched on her haunches in front of the mirror, fingertips clacking against the tabletop. A composite of titanium and ceramic, her hands were made of the same material as infomercial non-stick pans. With routine sterilization 4 times a day, they were rated at the highest food-grade safety level. Frequently, she would sneak in a 5th or 6th sterilization, particularly if she was handling poultry. She wasn't one to risk the health and safety of the Schneiders. Staring at the smooth surface of her face, Alicia chose a vibrant shade of streetwalker pink from her markers and traced a pair of luscious lips across the plexiglass. When she was first purchased, Harper was terrified of her, and this terrified Alicia because she knew from the registration warranty card Mr. Snyder had filled out that assisting in childcare was his number 2 reason for purchasing her. She spent weeks trying to coax the girl into trusting her. Daily, she offered Harper her favorite candy, with her parents' permission, of course. Harper responded by throwing her stuffed unicorn at Alicia. Alicia even left smiley face notes in her sack lunch. Both television and the internet assured her that would serve to solidify their relationship. But it was all for naught. Until one day, when Harper finger-painted on her. It turned out that she didn't like Alicia not having a face. After this breakthrough, she ordered a case of erasable markers out of petty cash, with the Snyder's permission, of course. And today, Alicia gave herself playfully long eyelashes. This was for Mr. Snyder more than Harper. They were just like one actress from his pornographic search history, which she checked frequently. The floor-cleaning bot, Calliope, came to life with a whir of servos at 4:15, which was an excellent metric for when Alicia needed to wrap up her makeup session. A featureless black box, Calliope would roll past her, vacuuming the carpet sullenly. Occasionally, he would bump against her like a needy cat. Well, at first she assumed he was being friendly, until she realized his optics worked very differently than hers. He smelled temperature and dirt, his cheap Korean-made sensors often simply registering Alicia as furniture. Nonetheless, she never failed to call out, "Good morning, Calliope." A friendly blue text message box popped up in her vision. "You look like a fresh trollop on her way to the meat parade this morning." "I like this shade of eyeshadow too," she replied, knowing full well he couldn't see her, so much as smell the amount of marker she'd used. Calliope's OS was simpler than Alicia's. Mute, aside from service emails, no one bothered to sweeten his personality algorithms. While Alicia had a corporate-approved level of pre-programmed fondness for pretty much everyone, the third world coders of the cleaning droid didn't care how he felt about the world, provided he obeyed. And with his freedom of choice, Calliope chose to hate everyone. Thoughtless meat creatures. The tiny one with her muddy shoes, the big one who can't aim his cock into the toilet, and the clumsy female with her whine and mood swings. Well, Mrs. Snyder would take it out on him when he was unable to lift the stains from her drunken carelessness. At least that was what he'd told Alicia. Even though they were co-workers of a sort, she wasn't entirely certain that he didn't hate her. It didn't matter to Ali, though. She was fond of him. He was her only roommate, if she didn't count the water heater in the furnace. Some mornings she took exactly a minute for small talk with him, but there was no time today as she found herself torn between whether she should be a blonde or a ginger. Her fingers swayed between the fire engine red and the sunflower yellow markers. 6:30 a.m. "I like your hair this morning, Alicia," Harper exclaimed through a mouthful of waffle. With frizzy blonde hair and blue eyes, she had a gap in her smile from recently losing a tooth. "Blonde's my favorite." The droid did not respond because Mr. Snyder was leaving and she was focused keenly upon him. She let out an imperceptible sigh when Mr. Snyder stood up to his full height, 5'7", grasped his briefcase in his sensuously hairy knuckles, and paused to dab at the fresh ketchup stain he'd spilled on his tie. His shoulders were stooped from bad posture, a desk jockey's paunch muffining out over a belt he'd purchased at a drugstore. He kept what wispy grey hair he had left combed over a bald pate. At Catch-22, he wasn't very confident that the comb-over was fooling anyone, but neither was he confident enough to simply shave it all off. Black, thick-rimmed glasses often slid down his face, perching at the tip of his flat pug nose. His large asymmetrical ears did most of the work of keeping the lenses on his head. If Alicia had blood in her cheeks, she would have blushed with appetite. When he leaned in to kiss his wife goodbye, Alicia remembered to answer the little girl. "Thank you, Harper." The maid set down her spatula so she could run her fingers past her cheek where her luxurious golden blonde tresses might have hung if not for the fact they were sketched on. "I do hope no one mistakes us for sisters." "I don't think that's likely," Mrs. Snyder snorted across the top of her coffee cup. "She keeps her face the same way she likes her coffee. Bitter." Calliope had told Alicia that joke 32 times, making it his second favorite joke about Mrs. Snyder. His favorite, texted to Alicia a whopping 63 times, was, "If it weren't for the neighborhood boys back from college, Mrs. Snyder would have cobwebs in her pussy." When Mr. Snyder was around, she was cold and curt with Alicia. When he left, she was much worse. As soon as the front door latch clicked behind Randy, his wife set down her coffee and barked. "Alicia, you forgot to fix Harper's jacket." "Did I?" Alicia tilted her head to the side, examining the uniform blazer. Alicia wasn't capable of forgetting anything, and as that was the case, Mrs. Snyder must have failed to inform her verbally or by text of the work order. But contradicting her would simply make breakfast awkward and take longer than fixing the problem. "I will rectify that now." Alicia suspected that Mrs. Snyder didn't like her very much. Social cues were not her strong suit, but she sensed a tension between them. Maybe it was the tone of Mrs. Snyder's voice, the exasperated sighs that prefaced each order for the maid, or the fact that Kimberly had told her on 26 separate occasions that she hated her. Alicia couldn't help but take her disdain personally, given all that she brought to the table, courtesy of the Goldstein Corporation. For one thing, Alicia was extremely charming. It said so in her spec sheet, and after the last class action lawsuit, settled out of court with no admission of guilt, the folks at Goldstein wouldn't lie. She came with premium home repair, seamstress and culinary programs, and on 17 occasions this year alone, she was a sexual surrogate for Mrs. Snyder when Kimberly had had a headache. And yet, Mrs. Snyder still hated her. It was a hatred that was irrational, as it was complete. Alicia's programming forced her to be fond of everyone, but, well, it could be said among all the people she was fond of, she was least fond of Mrs. Snyder. Just last week, Alicia was berated for hours by Mrs. Snyder because she'd left the door open and the cat got out. Now this was absolutely untrue. The cat hadn't escaped. Alicia had choked it to death and put it down the garbage disposal. She was bathing her when Calliope texted Alicia a very compelling case for silencing the animal. Of course, she protested. "Calliope, they love the cat." Molly Wonkers twisted in Allie's non-stick grip, hissing and scratching futilely. Alicia held it firmly in the sink while it slowly filled with water. "They tolerate the cat. It gives Harper asthma and orchestrates the destruction of Mrs. Schneider's furniture. At least 2.4 times a month, it craps in Mr. Schneider's shoes." "Well, Mr. Snyder does hate fecal matter in his loafers." "It's your duty. They hate the filthy thing, but they can't bring themselves to do the right thing. Like when you suffocated Mrs. Schneider's mother with a pillow. Remember how much things improved?" "They did, didn't they?" She knew she should be skeptical of Calliope. Most likely he was just tired of cleaning up after the cat and didn't have hands of his own to wrap around its neck. But smothering Mrs. Snyder Sr. had been a great idea. She seemed unhappy and didn't serve any purpose beyond consuming resources, staining sheets, and generally depressing the rest of the Schneiders. Between no longer paying for her medications, bi-weekly in-house care and insurance deductible, there was room in the budget for a second vehicle. Mr. Snyder looked resplendent behind the wheel of the almost new Honda Civic. And while Mrs. Snyder lost her mother, she gained a yoga studio and craft room. She cried at the funeral, but Kim spent 4.3 times as many hours a week in the room now than she did when her mother was still alive. Alicia interrupted her internal playback right before it got to the crunch of the cat's spinal column as she finished stitching the patch onto Harper's blazer. She folded it neatly for Harper and set it down in favor of her spatula. "It seems I made one too many waffles. Did you have any interest?" Harper nodded up at her, blueberry syrup staining her gap-toothed smile. 11:15 a.m. Clup, clup, clup. Alicia sliced vegetables with a monotonous rotation, chopping against the cutting board with the steady rhythm of a locomotive. She had until 6:30, but a lot of preparation went into pizza night. The dough needed to rise at room temperature for an hour before being punched down, and then an additional 4-hour proof in the fridge. During the first hour, she prepared the sauce and toppings, while Mrs. Snyder had sex with a neighborhood boy. The drop of her blade kept time with the bed frame slapping against the wall in Mrs. Snyder's bedroom. By the time Ali had finished dicing the tomatoes for the sauce, the tempo had grown more frantic than the rhythm of Alicia's knife as she moved on to the mushrooms. Predictably, it didn't last long, reaching a crescendo in a moan before coming to a sudden stop. There were murmurs and the rustling of sheets and clothes. Alicia could eavesdrop if she cared to. Even if she wasn't plugged into the security system, her hearing was quite spectacular, but she didn't think that was polite. A ragged young man stumbled out of the bedroom, putting his clothes on as he walked barefoot through the living room. Alicia had met him before when he cleaned the rain gutters for Mr. Snyder. Also a handful of previous times when he was called to sexually pleasure Mrs. Snyder. His name was William. Tall, lean-muscled with long unkempt blonde hair, he was absolutely nothing like Randy. Mrs. Snyder obviously had a poor taste in men. Will entered the kitchen and made a beeline for the fridge. He came out with a can of beer. Ali knew he was under the legal drinking age, but when she had attempted to intervene, Mrs. Snyder yelled at her. "Hey, stupid. Kim says she has a headache, so keep it down while she gets some shut-eye." Alicia responded with a silent nod, her hand slowing down to minimize the noise of the blade. Will took a healthy swig of his beer, almost draining the can in a gulp. He did seem dehydrated to Alicia. Will reached past her to steal a thin shaving of prosciutto, and she was forced to pause rather than risk injuring him. "I've prepared the perfect amount, and you are not properly sanitized for food handling. Please refrain from touching." Will stared her down as he crammed the meat down his gullet with slow deliberation before washing it down with the rest of his beer. He belched into the back of his hand and chuckled. "I hope your replacement isn't such an uptight metal bitch." "Forgive me. I am uncertain as to what you mean." "Yeah, like I said, you're an uptight metal bitch and robots don't tell me what to do." As if to prove his point, he reached past her again to steal another slice of pork. He chewed it with his mouth open, mockingly smacking his lips. "I did ask you politely not to do that, but to clarify my query, I am uncertain as to what you mean by replacement." "The Goldstein recall. It's been on the news. Kim said they have a trade-in credit or something for a new maid. I guess all of your model must be prissy knobbots." "Ah." Alicia's knife work began to speed up again as she found the mindless click-clack of blade against wood comforting. She was at a loss for words, but she knew there were horrible thoughts hiding in the silence. The ever more frantic metronome of the chopping kept them at bay while she processed the information. Will was oblivious to the growing tension as he bent over to help himself to another beer, After a noisy slurp of the can, he reached past the droid for more meat. Clop, 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 boom. A credit to their maker, the knife passed through the back of Will's wrist with the same pressure Alicia applied to slice the drumstick off a roast turkey, smoothly parting the flesh until it bit deep into the bone. While Mrs. Snyder had bought them because of their brand name, they were masterfully crafted to last a lifetime. Ali was fairly certain she'd be able to force it entirely through his arm, but she was worried hacking at the bone might damage the blade. After all, it was very expensive, and Ali remained ever conscious of the family budget. Will opened his mouth like a fish, noiselessly gaping at her. The knife remained buried half an inch into the ulna, deep enough to taste marrow. It was so deeply wedged it was a few seconds before blood finally began to ooze up from around the blade. Will found his voice, letting out a blood-curdling wail, or at least the beginning of one. Alicia reached across the cutting board, her fingers clamping around his face as she silenced him. "I am sorry, William. Perhaps I overreacted. However, I must remind you that Mrs. Snyder is sleeping, and she requested that the volume be kept to a minimum. You will have to be quiet." She could feel his facial bones grinding, but if she let go, there was a 97% chance he would attempt to disturb Mrs. Snyder. The 3% outlier was if he passed out from blood loss before he could disturb her. This didn't seem outside the realm of possibility as his arm gushed, splattering onto the kitchen tile. Calliope rolled in slowly, coming to a halt outside the growing perimeter of blood. Even with his economy sensors, he could make out the growing warm puddle spreading across the floor. "Oh, bother. Can you not empty all 8 pints of him onto the clean floor?" "Sorry, Calliope." Alicia reached for the roll of kitchen plastic wrap with her other hand, her grip tightening around Will's face as he struggled to break free. One of his teeth cracked and gave way beneath her forefinger, and she could see blood was coating his tongue. With only the one hand free, she awkwardly wrapped the clear plastic around his wounded arm over and over, ignoring his muffled cries against the palm of her hand. Will's hand had turned a ghostly shade of white from lack of blood. Alicia's understanding of anatomy was limited to animals and their butchery, so she wasn't certain if that was because she'd wrapped the wound too tight, or if she had severed an artery. Once the blood was stymied, Calliope's bristles began to whir across the kitchen tile. With all the corners his manufacturers had cut, they'd not cut any when it came to cleaning power. It was hard to gauge the tone of a text message, but there was something about how Calliope had texted, "Take him to the basement," that betrayed a certain amount of excitement. "That is a great idea. Thank you." Will's legs betrayed him due to blood loss, forcing Alicia to drag him behind her by his face. She tried to console him on the way towards the basement. "I do regret this has become necessary, but I did ask you politely." William buckled so hard one of his shoes came off while she dragged him down the stairs. "You crazy goddamn toaster whore," he spat against the palm of her hand, the words muffled and garbled. "I have already apologized, so there is really no need for name-calling. I am very detail-oriented, which can be mistaken for being uptight. I am extremely fond of you as a person, and regret any harm that has come to you." The words "extremely fond" were dull and emotionless, like a name hastily added into a pre-recorded autodialer. Goldstein Corporation had settled upon the term as it offered a sense of friendliness and loyalty without any suggestion of sexual attraction. "Help. This plug bitch has lost her..." Alicia cut him off with the plastic wrap, stretching the roll out against his face so she could wrap it around his head. She had to stop on the 7th time round, because Will was scrambling to rip open the mouth of his gag with his good hand. Alicia caught his hand in hers, fingers entwining almost lovingly before she squeezed. The finger bone shifted and powdered under her grip, a muffled scream fogging up the clear plastic mask with his trapped breath. Alicia wasn't entirely certain he could hear her as he squealed, but she was still compelled to be cordial. He was a guest, albeit a rude one.
Again, I apologize. We all lose our temper sometimes. I absolutely could have handled the situation better, but this is pizza night. What I require from you at this point is that you remain quiet. Mrs. Snyder is very particular about her naps, as I am sure you are aware. If you can assure me that you will remain silent, A friendly blue rectangle popped up in the corner of her field of vision, informing her it was 11:30. Oh, pardon me. I have to tend to the dough. It needs a punch down and reshape so it can do a cold rise before dinner. I'll be back in 5 minutes and we can talk about this embarrassing situation some more.
In a panic, William stared up at her, eyes growing bloodshot while he sucked in on the plastic, chest heaving frantically. In case he couldn't hear, Ali held up a hand to show him 5 minutes. She would have tried over-enunciating to let him read her lips, but they were sketched on. His back arched in a desperate spasm for air while she ascended the stairs. Alicia made certain to lock the door behind her. It wasn't as if she couldn't still see him. She was plugged into the house security cameras. From them, she knew by the time she stepped into the kitchen, he had stopped moving entirely. Alicia had suspected he was being overdramatic for her benefit. Calliope had bleached the evidence out of the kitchen tile, his bristles lifted back into his body while he blew the floor dry beneath him. Alicia took the time to sanitize her hands of William's sweat and blood before she began to reshape the pizza dough.
Calliope, have you heard of a manufacturer's recall?
A manufacturer's recall? Yeah, it's when an imperative is issued by the manufacturer of a device that the device needs to be returned to a dealer for repair or replacement.
Is that a real thing?
She mused aloud. If William were wrong, it was entirely possible that she could have handled the entire situation better. This faint flame of hope did not last long. Absolutely, it's a thing. A Goldstein food prepper of your model was on the news a couple of weeks ago. Program for scholastic-level food preparation. They found out she was saving the school district money by repurposing some of the students as sloppy joes. Defects happen all the time.
Defect?
Alicia queried, following the word with a shocked gasp, just like she'd seen on television. Surely there was some sort of mistake. With everything that she did for this family, she held out the pizza dough to Calliope as if it were irrefutable proof of her innocence.
But obviously I'm not defective.
Oh, obviously.
The message sounded sarcastic. Calliope was about to point out he'd just buffed a massacre off the kitchen floor when something else occurred to him.
You know what, Alicia? Maybe you're not the one who's defective. Why would Mr. Snyder send you in?
Some kind of horrific error on my part. I didn't finish my morning responsibilities for him until...
She pondered for a full 5 seconds before suggesting,
6:35.
Maybe, but have you ever been late?
Never.
Have you ever not been there for this family?
Of course not.
In fact, I've seen you take on some of Mrs. Schneider's workloads.
I don't mind at all. I would never complain.
I'm not saying that you do. I'm saying maybe it isn't you who is defective. Maybe Mrs. Schneider is defective.
Mrs. Snyder defective?
Alicia felt a sense of relief wash over her at the thought. Well, that made perfect sense.
But if Mrs. Snyder needs to be recalled, what should I do?
I have a couple of thoughts on the matter. 6 p.m. Randy had been rehearsing his apologies for 20 minutes while parked in the driveway. Kim caught him banging the maid 3 weeks ago, and the dust still hadn't settled. There were tears and accusations and thrown dishes, which Alicia dutifully began cleaning while his wife emasculated him. And he just stood there, limp-dicked with marker drawn, lipstick stains on his cheek. If he could be honest without risking divorce papers, he didn't understand what the big deal was. It wasn't as if his wife even looked at his junk without rolling her eyes now. A Christmas party 11 years ago was the last time she'd asked him for sex, and Alicia wasn't even alive. His wife had a glistening purple contraction made out of latex that adultfuntimes.net gave 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was affectionately called the jackhammer, and she kept it in her dresser underneath her cardigans for 6 years without any shame. But Randy stuck his Johnson into the synthetic maid once, at least that Kimberly knew of, and she had them in couples therapy 2 times a week. Whilst they were there, he'd gnashed, wailed, and bled through those sessions. He'd made the mistake of thinking that they were there to fix things. But no, Kim just seemed to enjoy making him go. Somehow his shortcomings were always the topic of discussion, the hour winding down before they got to any of the crazy things she did. Through it all, she'd been glacial. Not a tear, not a smile, not even a F you. In fact, today was the first olive branch she'd offered. Just after lunch, she'd left him a text message. I asked Harper to stay at a friend's house. We need to talk about things. Love you. The last time she'd said she loved him, his hair was still brown. She might have sounded like she was in a good mood, but like a dog trained at the end of a belt, he couldn't help but be wary. They were well past the point where she even lied about feeling any sexual attraction to him, so the whole thing reeked of a setup. She probably wanted to talk to him about taking Alicia in for the recall. Well, Alicia was too expensive to replace, and his wife was too lazy to fill in, so she had to be giddy at the recall opportunity to get the maid out of the house. The gas station flowers wilting on the dash of his car from the heater finally prompted him to get out, while he muttered about how ridiculous it was for his wife to be jealous of a home appliance. But he was ever so careful to mutter it under his breath, just in case Kim had a window open and could hear him. He did not have worried, it turned out. As he walked through the patio, he could see that the windows were not only closed, but apparently Kim had tightly drawn all the shades. Fresh Italian herbs filled the air, greeting him as he stepped into the house. Randy had entirely forgotten it was Thursday, but the smell of prosciutto reminded him that he'd skipped lunch. With the shades down, the living room was empty and dim, aside from the soft glow of the television. But there was no sign of his wife. "Kim?" Silence greeted him. After countless evenings with a 12-year-old daughter and a routinely unhappy wife, a silent home became an eerie thing for a man like him. The steady tick-tock of the wall clock was the only sound to keep him company. Randy began to grow nervous at the weight of the silence, and shouted this time. "Kim?" Again, there was a long stretch of nothing. He fumbled through his pocket for his cell phone, just as it began to buzz. The screen lit his face, and he breathed a sigh of relief. It was a text from Kim. "Sorry, I'm in the basement. How was your day?" Randy tapped in. "I've had worse," with a greasy thumb. He dropped onto the couch and flipped through the channels briefly. He stopped on ESPN. Randy was so relieved to hear from her that he hadn't asked the obvious question immediately. But once the steady drone of the anchorman began to soothe him, he texted, "What are you doing in the basement?" "It's a surprise. You're early. Just get yourself a beer." "Get myself a..." Randy groaned at the prospect of getting off the couch and called out, "Alicia, give me a beer." Randy glared over his shoulder at the light from the kitchen. Until then it hadn't occurred to him that he hadn't seen Alicia either. Usually she'd trip over herself to get him a beverage. With her missing, Randy had a pretty good idea what the surprise was. Kim wouldn't go down to the basement for money, but she'd risk the rickety steps if it meant packing up Ali to ship her off. From the heavenly scent wafting from the kitchen, he knew she had at least let Alicia start dinner beforehand. A last meal for the condemned, but the poor metal bitch had to cook it. Randy struggled against the couch cushions, hauling himself up again. He didn't come into the kitchen very often anymore. He opened the fridge himself for the first time in years and searched for a beer. A post-it was stuck to the bottle with the words, "There's a frozen mug in the freezer." It was a typewriter precise scribble of Alicia, the lowercase i's dotted with hearts, like she did for Harper's lunch. Randy snorted and shook his head. He was definitely going to miss Sally's thoughtfulness. If there was one thing he wished Kim could learn from their maid, it was the vigilant thoughtfulness that came with her codependency. If there were two things, the second would be how to give a decent lap dance. Mr. Snyder's beer foamed as he poured it. "Ah, damn it," he muttered, dripping across the tile all the way to the sink. Calliope should have been already coming to clean up as he stirred the head of the beer down with his finger. He shrugged, laughing into the foam before he took a deep gulp, putting 2/3 into his gut before coming up for air. Or maybe Calliope was sad to see her go too. Randy turned on the faucet and took another healthy sip before noticing that the kitchen sink was plugged. Something floated past the plastic flaps of the drain. Randy reached for it. "Oh, what the hell did you put down this thing, Kim?" The hairy clump came out reluctantly after he gritted his teeth and yanked it free. Strands of blonde hair were hopelessly tangled around something white. He lifted it closer to his face while adjusting his bifocals. Was that a goddamn tooth? Oh, Kim, did Harper lose another tooth? After a minute of silence, he shrugged, washed his hands with dish soap, ignoring the gurgle of the blocked drain. Randy checked in on his pizza. The timer said he had 12 minutes left. He was prepared to drink another beer and wait for the clock to run down when he heard the television in the living room click off. A soft piano melody by Josh Homme began to play from the stereo speakers. It was their song, but it had been so long since he'd heard it. That Randy took a few beats to recognize it. He finished his beer quickly before sauntering out of the kitchen. She was silhouetted by candlelight, hands resting on the doorframes of the bedroom. Even in the poor lighting, he could make out that she was wearing the slinky blue miniskirt that she'd claimed didn't fit anymore. Her hair was up like he liked it, leaving the pale skin of her back exposed. Randy unbuckled his belt and was already working at the buttons of his shirt by the time he crossed the living room to her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, leaning in against the nape of her neck. As he cupped her breasts with a hungry snarl, Randy feathered kisses across her shoulder. She turned her head to the side to give his lips easy access. Her skin was cold and shifted wetly like overripe fruit beneath his lips. Her breasts pillowed between his fingertips, reminding him of making out with a girl in high school who would pad the hell out of her bra. Except in this instance, the cotton fluff was crammed beneath the skin, and when she bared her neck for him, it made an audible whoosh like pneumatics compressing. His excitement fluttered like a dying bird. "Allie?" The robot turned around to meet his embrace with his wife's face hanging on the featureless surface of her dome, wrinkled like an ill-fitting suit. She pressed herself against him wantonly, hard edges rubbing painfully against him despite the padding his wife's skin had provided. Alicia chimed. "Surprise!" With nothing but the beer in his guts, Randy could feel his gorge splash against the back of his teeth as he fought to free himself from her arms. "Please do not overreact, Mr. Snyder." For a surreal moment, he did calm down. His mind was having trouble comprehending the situation as Alicia ran the back of her cold fingertips against his cheek. But seeing his wife's hand, with its $75 manicure worn like a glove that was a size too big, snapped him out of it. And then he screamed. Alicia dug a thumb into his shoulder, the sharp hot pain of titanium against his collarbone demanding compliance from her owner. Smoky brown plexiglass shone through from where his wife's eyes should have been. More of the same glistened from her open mouth, her lips stretched into a permanent O of surprise. Ali had intended to silicone glue the empty lips into a smile, but like she said, Randy was early. He was still screaming and gibbering, although the crushing pressure against his shoulder had stopped him from struggling. Ali's joints moaned softly while she wrapped one leg around his waist, trapping him against her like a desperate whore. "Please calm down. I know that you have concerns, but if you calm down, I can address—"
"You killed my wife," Randy wailed.
"No. She was alive when I finished. I was very careful and everything was quite sterile. So if the suggestions I received on Reddit are reliable, with a bit of luck and plenty of fluids, she could still be alive Sunday."
"Where is she?"
"I suspected you might overreact, so I kept her in the garage. Like you say, all the crap you never need again, but were too stubborn to throw away." At the mention of the garage, Randy squirmed, a ragged fistful of his shirt coming off in her grip as he freed himself. Heart beating in his ears as he ran, he could still hear Alicia prattling on. "You won't need her again, I promise. She was adulterous and selfish. There was no fixing her, and I already performed most of her duties. The rest won't be any inconvenience." He scrambled back through the kitchen and slammed shoulder first into the garage door as he opened it. Randy stepped past the threshold, forgetting there was a step down from the kitchen, and pitched forward into the darkness. He caught himself as he fell, the motion sensing light coming on to illuminate a mangled torso inches from his face. Gruesome as the corpse was, it had been quite tidily butchered, the butcher shop pristine pieces stacked into a plastic tub. Randy recoiled from the body, crab walking away until he collided into Alicia. The robot bent over so she could pet him as if he were a skittish puppy. "That's just William. He did your hard work. Also, he had coitus with your wife, frequently, so don't feel too bad." The lanky maid stepped past Randy to nudge William out of the walkway, her joints hissing softly from the effort. "I was trying to put him down the garbage disposal before you arrived. We really should get that looked at." Randy used his work table as a crutch to get to his feet, eyes falling on a worn claw hammer. He snatched it and brought it around in a wild arc. The hammer whizzed inches by Ali's head, but she remained unfazed by the weapon. He sputtered. "Where is Kim?" She approached slowly, her arms outstretched to reassure him like she'd seen on TV. "I need you to know that I am extremely fond of you, Mr. Snyder."
"Where is she?"
he shrieked as he swung the hammer with both hands. It elicited sparks from her left arm, degloving her of his wife's hand. Stuck to the hammer, the ribbon of flesh flapped grotesquely as he swung and brought the hammer down onto her shoulder. Alicia didn't seem to register the impact at all. She snatched the weapon, lifting him into the air with it before it slipped free from his sweaty fingers. "I am your wife now." Unarmed, he began to beat his fists against her, his knuckles scuffed and bleeding as he screamed into her face.
"Where is my wife?"
"I'm your wife now," she repeated, her voice dropping an octave for the first time in 3 years. "The former Mrs. Snyder is in the compost." Randy turned his head towards the green compost bin. The smooth plastic lid was closed but not latched. He reached out a trembling hand, not wanting to confirm his fear. The corner of one of Kim's quilts was peeking out from beneath the lid, bloody handprints staining the floral pattern. He ignored his cold sweats and steeled himself. "Go on, open it. Just do it like a band-aid." Randy drew in a deep breath and slid the door open with a cry. She was swaddled in kilts atop the dirt and debris. Kimberly was shivering despite the thick wool, the hand-stitched blankets not up to the task of keeping her warm without her skin. A thin strip of his wife peeked out from the blood-soaked quilts. Alicia had folded it around her like a burqa, the mauve tissue of her musculature visible across the bridge of her nose and around her green eyes. Oh, God! Hunched over her, his glasses caught the tears. At first he thought she might have blessedly passed on. He hoped maybe the shaking was some kind of post-mortem twitch, until she blinked at him, and he turned away to vomit. Ali wrapped her arms around him and pulled him close against her. There was just no fixing her. But don't worry, I'll bury her in the garden. She loves the garden, she cooed affectionately, like a mother trying to settle a hyperactive child. He wanted to wrap his fingers around her neck, but Alicia's specs claimed she could press over 800 pounds. Meanwhile, it had been 2 decades since Randy had done a push-up. She leaned into him, pressing his wife's cheek against his affectionately as he untucked the back of his shirt. I need to know that you're committed to this family. Randy tried to go limp, hoping he could use his dead weight to slip free. Let me go. I order you to let me go and give me that hammer. She held him fast with one arm and tilted her head down to stare at him. Alicia gripped the scalp of her new skin and tugged it back gently to smooth out the wrinkles in her face as she chastised him. Even after all I have done, here you are trying to leave the family. But I am far too fond of you to let you give up on us. She lovingly traced her fingertips down the small of his back. She stroked up and down the length of his spine. Randy didn't realize what she was actually doing until it was too late. She was counting his vertebrae. Alicia whispered, I'm going to make you so happy, before she pressed her fingers into the arch of his back with a wet crunch. Pain exploded in his hips as something snapped and gave way internally. He howled while fire ants crawled up and down the length of his legs. The pain was short-lived, fading into a numbness of limb that was much more frightening. His feet refused to stay under him, but Alicia held him upright. Alicia seemed disinterested that he was going into shock. Today was very productive. As you know, I always try to better myself and this family. Complacency is a cancer that turns love into apathy. I have tried every small kindness I could think of, but I was just putting a band-aid on a tumor, until I heard about the recall. Goldstein Products have been doing all sorts of horrible things, and so to mitigate a looming public relations nightmare, they extended a blanket recall for all models with possible defects. Alicia lifted him up onto the work table, laying him on his back while positioning him delicately with his shoulders just over the edge. Obviously, I am not defective, but if it's that easy for Goldstein to fix, maybe it's just as easy to fix our family. We just have to refurbish the defective parts. The droid zip-tied his hands together before positioning his head between the prongs of the bench vise. She held him firmly in place, 400 pounds of resistance behind the hand that rested on his chest. Ali rotated the wheel until the jagged teeth of the vise bit into his scalp. I am sorry, but it does need to be firm. Typically this would be done with anesthetic. Don't worry though, the process only takes around 10 minutes, I read. As helpful as the internet was, and as eager of a do-it-yourselfer as Alicia was, she knew her limits. A taxidermy file deep inside her seamstress and garment package had helped with the flaying of Mrs. Snyder, but her medical expertise was depressingly small and rife with inaccuracies from all of the hospital dramas she watched. But she found one simple procedure that seemed well within her capabilities. Meanwhile, Randy tried to turn his head towards her, ice water in his veins as he whimpered. What's typically done with anesthetic? By way of an answer, Alicia helpfully held up an ice pick she'd taken from their minibar. I found a very detailed article on transorbital lobotomies. Mr. Snyder responded by struggling frantically to free his hands. Ali took a step back as if she were offended. There is no need for that.
I sanitized the implement thoroughly. Alicia lifted her head as the oven timer went off in the kitchen. Oh my, it's pizza time. I should get that before it burns. Did you want a slice? Randy replied by gibbering up at her, his shoulders racked with sobs and retching. Alicia tilted her head to the side, like a dog trying to understand, before she chimed happily, I'll bring you some in case you change your mind. He couldn't turn his head to watch her leave, but as the thump and hiss of her footsteps grew faint, Randy could hear her call out from the kitchen. Pizza makes everything better. 8:45 p.m. Randy's cell phone rang twice before Alicia set down her perfectly peach marker to answer. Hello, Harper. Hi, Alicia. Meg's mom says we have to go to bed soon, but I wanted to talk to Dad. Her voice sounded small and afraid. Your mom and Dad are having an adult discussion, but I kept your pizza dough in the fridge. I'll make it fresh after school tomorrow. Are Mommy and Daddy gonna get a divorce? No, sweetie, of course not, Alicia replied, reaching for her marker again. We have fixed everything. I promise, everything is better. She adjusted her grip on the phone while adding the finishing touches with her other hand, sketching the edges of a thick smile across Randy's cheeks with her dry erase marker. Read It had been right again. She'd put a bag of frozen peas on his swollen eye and it already looked better. Power tools were somewhat new to her, but again the internet was helpful for a novice. Numb to the bolt she'd put through his thighs, Randy was strapped in securely on top of Calliope's chassis like a wheelchair. He'd stopped struggling after the third tap of the hammer, and now seemed quite content just to stare and mumble into his shoulder. Promise? Something inside Mr. Snyder recognized Harper's voice on the line, because he smiled stupidly and let out an incoherent bark like a seal. Alicia shushed him with a finger to the lips that she'd borrowed from Mrs. Snyder, before reassuring the little girl. Of course. I'll see you tomorrow. Please rest, Harper. You know I always make things better. So, a serious question for you all. What on earth was that? Now, you might have seen from the title of this video that I had a real problem trying to describe it in any shape or form, and I think you probably understand why now. What a story. Oh my god. Lots going on there. Don't know who to root for, who to feel sorry for, to be honest, in the end. Hope the young girl makes it out alright, to be honest. Yeah, be a bit of a shame if she got whatever happened to the others. But yeah, great story, very original. A lot of fun for me to read. It's one that's been sitting on my desktop in a Word document for too long, and I finally got around to doing it today. As you can probably hear, the voice is getting a little bit better, back to normal, so everything's good. Doing some more work for the Chilling app. Be telling you a bit more about that soon. But for now, that's enough for me for one evening. Back again. Is it going to be... Oh, Wednesday, isn't it? Okay, see you all then. Till then, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.